Pastor Chris contacted me several weeks ago about preaching today. Since it's Welka Thank Offering Sunday, she thought it would be nice to have a woman preach for her. Of course, I said I would be honored to. It usually takes me about 3 weeks to write a sermon, not the 3 hours or 3 days or however long it might take a pastor. So thanks for thinking of me, Pastor Chris, and for that gift of time. But then I looked over the lessons for today and learned that the gospel was the parable of the talents. I had preached on this once before and shared that trying to figure it out gave me that same feeling I would get trying to solve the dreaded word problems of Algebra 2 in high school. In fact, the first commentary I ran across doing research said this, and I quote, "The parable of the talents is among the most abused texts in the New Testament." Well, thanks again, Pastor Chris. And ironically, about the same time I started preparing, our youngest daughter was interviewing for a job with a Lutheran church in Austin. One of her interview questions was, "What is your favorite Bible story?" She replied something to the effect that it would be hard to choose a favorite, but she was really puzzled by the parable of the talents. She said she would probably be the unlucky third servant and bury it because that's what people generally did back then. Or if she had been given more and tried to invest it, what if she lost it all? Either way, she was fearful. So maybe a safe starting point is to describe what the parable of the talents is not. It is definitely not promoting venture capitalism and the gospel of wealth or prosperity gospel theology still floating around among television evangelists. Economists point to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, as the first major explanation of capitalism. Not the parable of the talents, written in approximately 80 Common Era. And even though currency is the central tool, Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians that Jesus was not driven by the currency of power, but by the currency of love. Another issue that troubles us is who is the master in the parable? Jesus is definitely talking about his return at some future, unspecified time. But how can we equate Jesus with the harsh master he describes, reaping what he doesn't sow and gathering what he doesn't plant? What if the master is just what Jesus described, a wealthy man who is entrusting his servants to continue his practices? What if this is one of those stories that Jesus gives us to challenge us, to provoke us into thinking outside the box, to make us willing to cross the road like he did and move beyond our comfort zones? There's a popular Facebook meme that claims "Be not afraid" appears 365 times in the Bible, one for each day of the year. Now, I'm not sure about that, but I know Jesus says it a lot. That third servant was afraid and is the only one to mention the harshness of the master. That third servant was afraid to make the commitment to act. And Jesus definitely wants us to act, to do his work when he's not around. Like our t-shirts say, God's work, our hands. When we are afraid and don't put our talents to use, what good are they? If our gifts are buried, we aren't doing the work of the master. And here's some good news. What Paul has done in his first letter to the Thessalonians and what Jesus has done in this parable of the talents is to teach us how to act in the here and now, even though the focus of both lessons is the second coming. 1 Thessalonians is Paul's very first letter to the emerging churches. It's the oldest book in the New Testament, and we are introduced to concepts he'll revisit again and again. We are the children of light, children of faith, love, and a hope of salvation. For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So how do we live day by day? According to Paul, encourage one another and build each other up as indeed you are doing, and indeed as you all are doing, through all the ways welcome members and all of you guys too work together to carry out the mission of our church. And just as we have these concepts and reassurances from Paul, we get them again in the parable of the talents. We are challenged to follow Jesus day by day, using all the gifts God has given us until he comes again. And we are challenged to follow him with a spirit of hopefulness, not fearfulness. We are reassured by the abundance of God's grace through this allegory of the talents. A talent was equal to about 6,000 denarii. 1 denarii was equal to a day's wages. So a single talent, which was the least that was given, would be about 20 years' worth of wages for the average worker. And 5 talents would be 100 years. And did you catch that little detail? When the master says, "You have been trustworthy in a few things, so I will give you many." That is some amazing grace. We are reassured of God's faithfulness. The timing of the master's return is unknown, but we know he's coming back. In return, we are to be faithful to him and follow his lead. So just as the servants who made a profit following their master, we are to faithfully follow Jesus' teachings. And what does that look like at St. Andrew Lutheran Church? It might be feeding the hungry, check. Helping the homeless, check. Visiting the sick, check. Encouraging one another, check. Or it might be putting on a fall festival for our community, or throwing a Christmas party for the New Life girls. Both of those check all sorts of boxes. We should never become complacent in what we're doing, because there's always more to do. But we are doing the work of the Master. And in this parable, we are reassured that when we do this, we will enter into the joy of the Master. What that must look like. What can that possibly feel like to get a glimpse of the kingdom come on earth? There's a concept called thin places that describes this feeling when heaven and earth touch. You might have gotten a taste of that feeling in some sort of mountaintop experience or in a beautiful natural setting. I know I have felt it at least once. Believe it or not, it was in a smelly, noisy high school gymnasium at a pep rally on a fall Friday afternoon. For you out-of-staters, you may not be aware that high school football is the second largest religion in Texas, especially in smaller towns. As usual, we teachers had to patrol the halls, making sure everyone made it into the gym. Because sometimes pep rallies aren't a fun place for kids who are poor in spirit, as Pastor Chris described a few weeks ago. There are lots of different groups in high school, just like out in the real world, and some kids struggle to fit in. Once we had everyone corralled, think herding cats, the rally started. But this one wasn't focused on the football players. This one was to honor and celebrate their biggest fan that season, the 10-year-old wheelchair-bound daughter of one of our coaches. She had an inoperable brain tumor. When Katie was introduced, everyone in that gym was on their feet chanting her name for a good 2 minutes. There weren't many dry eyes among the adults in that gym, but there was grace all over that place. And there was hope and love and encouragement. There weren't separate groups of kids. There was a community of love, and we were sharing in the joy of the Master.